The mountain did not forgive weakness. That was the first thing Caleb Rourke had learned when he chose solitude over society, snow over cities, and silence over grief. The second thing he learned was that grief never truly left. The wind howled like a wounded animal outside the cabin, clawing at the wooden walls as if it meant to tear them apart plank by plank. Snow slammed against the small windows in furious waves, blinding the world beyond the glass. Inside, a single lantern flickered, casting long shadows across the rough-hewn room. Caleb Rourke sat alone at the small pine table, unmoving. Christmas Eve. Another one. The iron kettle hung forgotten over the hearth, water long since cooled. His boots were still on, snow crusted along the seams, his coat heavy with cold, but he hadn't bothered removing it. He rarely did these days. There was no one to warm the room for. No laughter, no soft humming, no gentle hands brushing snow from his shoulders. Once there had been. Caleb's jaw tightened as his gaze drifted to the far corner of the cabin. A folded shawl lay draped over the back of a chair, untouched for 3 winters now. Anna. The name echoed like a ghost. She had loved Christmas, loved the quiet magic of it, the way the snow softened the world, the way candlelight made everything gentler. She used to say the mountains felt closer to heaven this time of year. She had been wrong. The mountains were merciless. Caleb pushed back his chair and stood abruptly, the wood scraping loudly against the floor. He crossed the room and added another log to the fire, though he barely felt the cold anymore. Pain had a way of numbing lesser sensations. Outside, the storm worsened. Then, a sound cut through the wind. A knock. Caleb froze. No one came up this mountain in a blizzard. No one sane, anyway. The knock came again, weak, uneven, desperate. His hand slowly moved to the rifle resting against the wall. "Who's there?" His voice was rough from disuse, scraped raw by silence. The wind answered. Then faintly, "Please," a woman's voice, barely audible. Caleb's heart slammed violently against his ribs.
When he opened the door, the storm rushed in like a living thing. Snow swept across the cabin floor as a figure collapsed forward, small, trembling, half buried in white. Caleb barely had time to catch her before she fell. She was freezing. Her body shook violently in his arms, breath coming in shallow gasps. Dark curls spilled from beneath a soaked hood, her face pale beneath the red bite of the cold. "Easy," he muttered, slamming the door shut with his boot. "You're safe now." He didn't know why he said it. He hadn't felt safe in years. Caleb carried her to the hearth, laying her gently on the rug. He stripped off her snow-heavy coat, revealing a simple wool dress beneath, thin, worn, entirely inadequate for mountain winter. "What were you thinking?" he muttered, though there was no anger in his voice, only disbelief. Her eyes fluttered open. They were the color of warm honey, and they looked straight into his soul. "I didn't have a choice," she whispered. Something in her voice broke him a little. Her name was Eleanor Whitfield. She told him later, much later, after warmth returned to her fingers and color slowly crept back into her cheeks. After she'd sipped hot broth by the fire, wrapped in one of his spare blankets. She was running. From what, she didn't yet say. Only that the stagecoach had abandoned her miles below the ridge when the storm hit. The driver had sworn no cabin stood this far up. "He was wrong," she said softly, staring into the flames. Caleb studied her in silence. She was not delicate in the way city women were, but there was a quiet grace to her, strength beneath the exhaustion, resolve beneath the fear, and sadness. He recognized that far too well. "You can stay until morning," he said, finally. "Storm won't let you leave anyway." Relief washed over her face so quickly it startled him. "Thank you," she breathed. I won't be trouble." He nodded once. Trouble had already arrived, and it had knocked. That night, Caleb lay awake on his narrow bed, staring at the low ceiling as the fire crackled softly. Eleanor slept on the other side of the room, wrapped in blankets near the hearth. He could hear her breathing, soft, uneven, as if even sleep could not fully convince her she was safe. He hadn't shared this space with another soul since Anna died. Every memory pressed in now. The cabin felt smaller, warmer, alive in a way it hadn't been in years. Caleb closed his eyes, and for the first time since his wife's grave was covered in snow,
By morning, the storm had not relented. Eleanor stood at the window, watching snow bury the world inch by inch. Sunlight filtered weakly through the clouds, turning the white endless and blinding. "I don't suppose I can leave today," she said gently. "No," Caleb replied. "Not if you want to live." She smiled faintly at that. Then she surprised him. "Then I'll help." "With what?" She turned, eyes bright despite everything. "Breakfast? Chores? Anything. I don't like being useless." Something twisted in his chest. Anna had said the same thing once. Days passed. The storm trapped them together, two strangers bound by snow and fate. Eleanor learned the rhythms of the cabin quickly. She baked bread with what little flour he had. She laughed when it burned and tried again. Her laughter filled spaces silence had ruled. At night they talked. Not about the past at first. About the mountains, about books she loved, about the stars he used to track before grief clouded everything. Slowly, dangerously, Caleb felt something thaw. On the fifth night, Eleanor stood by the fire, her face lit gold in shadow. "Caleb," she said softly. "Yes?" "There's something you should know about me." He looked at her then, truly looked, and realized the storm hadn't come to destroy him. It had come to change everything. The fire cracked softly between them. Eleanor stood near the hearth, her hands clasped tightly before her as if she were holding herself together by force alone. Shadows danced across her face, making her look older than her years, like someone who had lived too much too fast. Caleb watched her in silence. He had learned, long ago, that when someone said, "There's something you should know," it meant whatever followed had the power to change everything. "I don't have to tell me," he said at last. "Not if you don't want to." Eleanor shook her head, slowly, deliberately. "No, I do. Because if I stay here, if I keep taking your kindness, I won't do it under a lie." Her voice trembled. Caleb straightened, his instincts sharpening. "All right?" She drew in a shaky breath. "I was supposed to be married." The words fell heavy between them. Caleb felt an unexpected twist in his chest, something sharp, unwelcome, and dangerously close to disappointment. He forced it down immediately. She owed him nothing. She was a guest, a stranger. "Supposed to be?" he asked quietly. "Yes." Her lips curved into a bitter smile. "To a man chosen for me, a man who wanted my family's land more than he wanted me." Caleb's jaw clenched. "I ran," she continued, "on Christmas Eve, in the middle of the night, with nothing but a small bag and whatever courage I could steal from myself." Silence followed. Outside, the wind moaned like it mourned something lost. "And he'll be looking for you," Caleb said, not a question. Eleanor nodded. "Eventually." The room felt sudden. That night, Caleb stood watch long after Eleanor had fallen asleep. Not because he feared the storm, but because he feared what was waking inside him. He hadn't meant to grow attached, hadn't planned on learning the way she liked her tea sweetened, or the way she hummed absent-mindedly when focused. He certainly hadn't planned on the way his eyes followed her, how his body reacted to her presence, warm and unsettling. "You're a widower," he reminded himself harshly, "and she is trouble." Yet, when he looked at her sleeping by the fire, a loose curl brushing her cheek, her expression soft and unguarded. He felt something dangerous. Hope. By the next morning, the storm finally began to ease. Eleanor stood at the door, gazing out at the mountains as if measuring the distance between safety and uncertainty. "It looks calmer," she said. Caleb joined her. "Looks can lie." She hesitated. "When the snow clears, I should leave." The words struck harder than he expected. "You could," he replied carefully. "But," she asked, turning to him, "but the pass will still be dangerous, and you've nowhere to go yet." She searched his face. "Are you offering me shelter?" she asked softly, "or something else?" Caleb's breath caught. "I don't know," he admitted, "and that's the truth." Eleanor nodded slowly. "That's enough for now." Days turned into a fragile rhythm. They worked together, hauling wood, repairing a section of roof the storm had damaged, sharing meals that somehow tasted better simply because they weren't eaten alone. Sometimes their hands brushed. Each time the contact lingered longer than necessary. Neither spoke of it. At night, conversations stretched by the fire, about childhood memories, about loss, about the lives they never expected to live. One evening, Eleanor asked quietly, "What happened to your wife?" The word wife still cut deep. Caleb stared into the flames. "She died in childbirth, winter fever. The baby didn't survive either." Eleanor's breath hitched. "I'm so sorry." He nodded once. "I thought if I stayed alone long enough, the pain would fade." "And did it?" He met her eyes. "No." The first touch that truly mattered came unexpectedly. Eleanor slipped on the icy path outside the cabin, losing her footing with a startled cry. Caleb caught her instinctively, arms locking around her waist, pulling her against his chest. They froze. Her hands rested flat against him. His breath mingled with hers in visible clouds. For one dangerous moment, the world disappeared. "Thank you," she whispered. He didn't let go immediately. Neither did she. When they finally stepped apart, something had shifted, unspoken, undeniable. That night, Caleb dreamed again. Only this time, it wasn't Anna who haunted his sleep. Trouble arrived with hoofbeats. Caleb heard them first, echoing against the mountains, sharp and wrong. He stepped outside, rifle in hand, heart pounding. 3 riders approached. Eleanor stood frozen in the doorway behind him. The man in front dismounted slowly, his eyes cold and calculating. "Eleanor Whitfield, you've run far enough." Her fingers clenched into Caleb's coat. "I won't go back," she said, voice shaking but firm. The man smiled cruelly. "You don't have a choice." Caleb stepped forward. "She does here." The mountains fell silent. The confrontation was brief but tense. Threats were made, promises of return were sworn. When the riders finally left, Eleanor collapsed against Caleb, shaking violently. "They'll come back," she whispered. "Yes," he said grimly. She looked up at him, fear and trust tangled together. "What do we do?" Caleb didn't hesitate. "You stay, and I'll protect you." The words surprised them both. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. "Why?" she asked softly. Caleb swallowed hard. "Because somewhere between that knock on my door and now, you became more than a guest." Silence stretched. Then Eleanor rose on trembling toes and pressed her lips to his cheek, soft, hesitant, achingly brief. "Thank you," she whispered. And Caleb knew he was already lost. That night, they stood closer than ever before. The fire burned low. The world outside waited. And between them hung a question neither dared ask. What happens when love arrives after you thought your heart was buried?
Sleep abandoned them both. Caleb lay rigid on his bed, staring into darkness, every sense painfully aware of Eleanor's presence just across the room. The fire had burned down to embers, bathing the cabin in a dim, amber glow. Her breathing was uneven. So was his. He hadn't meant to promise protection, hadn't meant to step into danger again, especially not for someone he barely knew. But when he'd looked into her eyes,
wide with fear and courage tangled together. Something old and instinctive had risen inside him. Purpose. Caleb pushed up from the bed and crossed the room quietly. "Eleanor," he murmured. She stirred instantly, as though she'd been waiting for him to speak. "Yes, we need to talk." She sat up, wrapping the blanket tighter around herself. "I was hoping you'd say that." They sat near the dying fire, closer than ever before. "The men who came today," Caleb said, voice low, "they won't stop, and I won't pretend otherwise." Eleanor nodded. "I know. If you stay," he continued, "your life becomes harder, dangerous. And if I leave," she replied, "it ends." He met her gaze sharply. She held it. "I will not go back to that man, not alive." The certainty in her voice settled something inside him. "All right, then we prepare." "For what?" she asked. "For winter, for pursuit, for whatever comes." A pause. "And for us?" Eleanor asked quietly. Caleb's throat tightened. "That," he said honestly, "is the only thing I don't know how to prepare for." The following days were filled with unspoken tension. Caleb taught Eleanor how to load a rifle, how to recognize fresh tracks, how to move quietly through snow without breaking its surface. She listened intently, absorbing everything. "You learn fast," he remarked one afternoon. She smiled faintly. "I've had to." There was admiration in his eyes, and hunger. That evening, Eleanor cooked stew while Caleb repaired a broken chair leg. The domesticity of it struck him unexpectedly, like a life he might have had if grief hadn't frozen him in time. She reached past him for a cloth. Their hands touched. This time, neither pulled away. The air thickened. Caleb's voice dropped. "Eleanor." She looked up at him, lips parted, eyes searching his face for permission or restraint. "Tell me to stop."
He didn't. The kiss was slow, tentative at first, like both of them were afraid the moment might shatter if rushed. Her lips were warm, softer than he imagined, tasting faintly of honey and wood smoke. Caleb's hands came up to her face almost without his consent. When she leaned into him, the control he'd clung to for years cracked. The kiss deepened. Years of loneliness poured into it. Regret, desire, need. Eleanor's fingers fisted into his shirt as if she feared falling. When they finally broke apart, both were breathless. "I shouldn't," Eleanor began. Caleb rested his forehead against hers. "I know." But neither stepped back. That night, Eleanor cried. It surprised them both. She sat on the edge of her makeshift bed, shoulders shaking silently, hands pressed to her face. Caleb knelt before her without hesitation. "What is it?" he asked softly. She laughed bitterly through tears. "I didn't expect kindness to hurt this much." He stilled. "All my life," she continued, "love was something bargained, traded, used as leverage. And now," she looked at him, "now I don't know how to accept something real." Caleb reached for her hand. "You don't have to know how. You just have to let it happen." She leaned into him, forehead resting against his chest. For the first time in years, Caleb held someone who was alive. The danger returned sooner than expected. Caleb spotted fresh tracks at dawn, multiple horses circling, testing the perimeter. He said nothing at first, but Eleanor saw it in his posture. "They're back," she said quietly. "Yes." Fear flashed in her eyes. "What if they won't take you," he cut in fiercely. "Not while I breathe." She touched his arm. "Promise me something." "Anything." "If this ends badly," she said, voice trembling, don't regret letting me stay." Caleb cupped her face gently. "This," he said, "is the first thing I won't regret." That night the storm returned, violent and unrelenting. Wind battered the cabin as if trying to break in. Thunder cracked overhead, shaking the walls. Eleanor woke screaming. Caleb was at her side instantly, pulling her into his arms. "You're safe," he murmured into her hair. "I've got you." She clung to him, breath ragged. "Don't let go." "I won't." And he didn't. They stayed like that until dawn, wrapped in blankets, bodies pressed together for warmth, hearts beating in fragile unison. Nothing more happened, but everything changed. Morning light revealed a truth neither could ignore. They stood together at the window, watching the mountains glow pale gold beneath fresh snow. "I love you," Eleanor said suddenly. The words stunned him. Caleb turned to her slowly, pain and wonder colliding in his chest. "I'm terrified of that," he admitted. She smiled sadly. "So am I." He took her hands. "But I love you too," he said. The confession felt like stepping off a cliff and finding wings. Yet love never comes without cost. As the days passed, the riders watched from afar. The mountains held their breath, and fate prepared its final test.
The mountains remembered blood. Caleb could feel it beneath his boots as he moved through the trees, slow, silent, lethal. Snow crunched softly, but he knew how to walk so even winter struggled to hear him. They had taken Eleanor at dawn, not by force alone, but by deception. A single rider had appeared at the cabin while Caleb was checking traps beyond the ridge. He had carried a letter sealed with Eleanor's family crest, a lie wrapped in familiarity. By the time Caleb returned, the cabin was empty. Blankets cold, fire dead, her scarf left behind on the chair like a final breath. Caleb had not screamed. Men like him never did. They hunted. Eleanor rode with her hands bound, back straight despite the pain in her wrists. Fear pulsed through her, but something stronger burned beneath it. Caleb would come. She knew it with terrifying certainty, and she prayed desperately that he wouldn't die for her. The man riding beside her leaned down. "You could have lived comfortably," he sneered. "Instead, you chose a savage in the mountains." Eleanor lifted her chin. "No, I chose a man." He struck her then, hard enough to split her lip. She tasted blood and smiled. Night fell like a blade. Caleb struck just before the campfire burned low. One man fell without a sound, throat opened cleanly. Another turned just in time to see death before it reached him. Chaos erupted. Horses screamed. Guns fired wildly into the dark. Caleb moved like something born of the storm. When the last man fled, bleeding and broken, Caleb was already cutting Eleanor's ropes. She collapsed into him. "You came," she sobbed. His hands trembled as he held her. Always. Blood soaked his sleeve. Not all of it was theirs. They did not return to the cabin immediately. Too dangerous. Instead, they took shelter in an abandoned trapper's hut high above the pass. Snow sealed them in, and silence wrapped around them like a vow. Eleanor tended Caleb's wounds by lantern light. "You're hurt," she whispered. "I've been worse." She pressed her forehead to his chest. "I can't lose you." He caught her face gently. "You won't." This time, when he kissed her, there was no hesitation. It was fierce, desperate, alive. Clothes were shed not in passion alone, but in survival. They came together slowly, reverently, as if understanding the weight of what they were choosing. When Eleanor cried out his name, Caleb held her like the world depended on it. For it did. Morning brought quiet. They lay tangled in blankets, the fire dying low, hearts finally unguarded. "I thought love ended with Anna," Caleb said quietly. Eleanor traced the scar over his heart. "Love doesn't end, it waits." He kissed her hair. "Then stay. Not because you're afraid, but because you want to." She looked up at him, eyes steady. "I choose you," she said, "every winter, every storm." Caleb closed his eyes, and for the first time since grief took everything, he believed in tomorrow. Spring came slowly to the Rockies. So did peace. Word spread that Eleanor Whitfield was dead. Caleb made sure of it. A new name followed them down the mountain when they finally left the cabin behind. They built a life further west, land of their own, far from bargains and chains. Some nights storms still came, and sometimes Eleanor would wake trembling. Caleb would pull her close and whisper, "I've got you," and she always slept again. Christmas Eve returned years later. Snow fell gently this time. Inside a warm cabin stood a tree, crooked, imperfect, beautiful. A child slept by the fire. Eleanor stood at the window, smiling softly. Caleb came up behind her, arms around her waist. "Do you ever think about that night?" he asked. She nodded. "The knock?" "Yes." Eleanor leaned back into him. "It wasn't a storm," she said quietly. "It was fate asking if we were brave enough to open the door." Caleb kissed her temple. "I'm glad we did." Outside, the mountains watched and kept